We're in a dark and dangerous place in America tonight where politics is driving our system of justice instead of Lady Justice being blind to politics. The story of Lieutenant General Michael Flynn is at that intersection of justice and politics, but in the end is so much bigger than politics. Whether you're left, right, agnostic, or indifferent, at its core, this is a story of injustice. It involves the usual players, protagonist, antagonist, big players and bit players. We pretty much know the who, what, where, when, and how. The fundamental question: on January 24, 2017, was Michael Flynn treated as per the rules like any other FBI target? The answer? A resounding no. He was treated differently, which brings us to the question, why? The answer to why brings us to an unsettling place, foreign to all of us who have spent our careers revering the American system of justice. It is that system of justice that distinguishes us from other countries. We are fair. We strive to achieve justice for all. No one is above our law, and no one is beneath it. It's why people clamor to come here, legally and illegally. As strong as the Statue of Liberty is in the harbor in New York, so also is a symbol of blind Lady Justice in courtrooms across this great nation. The facts of this story are simple. Flynn was in the crosshairs of the FBI, targeted by the same players who, we already know from publicized text messages and emails, tried to prevent a certain candidate from becoming president and promote another. They were dirty. They were liars, some under oath. They were leakers, and they were corrupt. Now, there's one important fact that you need to remember. The conversation Flynn had with the Russian ambassador during the transition was legal, perfectly legal. Take that one to the bank. It is what is done in every new administration. The setup? Michael Flynn was called by Deputy FBI Director Andrew McCabe and told that the FBI wanted to talk to Flynn about the Russians, and the quickest way to do it was to keep the lawyers out. A clear violation of protocol, White House rules, and ultimately Flynn's constitutional rights. Now, we know this because U.S. District Court Judge Emmett Sullivan ordered prosecutors to hand over FBI files of the Flynn interrogation instead of sentencing him as scheduled. 48 hours later, the files are handed over, or as per the judge's directive, although incomplete and redacted. They confirm what Director Comey himself admitted and what the judge apparently suspected, that the DOJ and FBI hatched a plan to deliberately and intentionally avoid protocol, standard operating procedure in an effort to entrap Michael Flynn. Now, Comey even admits this when he pulls off the mask of Cardinal Comey to reveal the face of a hardened political operative who deliberately trapped Flynn. He not only admitted it with unfiltered hubris, he prided himself on what any other decent man of honor would have been horrified to admit: that the rules, the law, and the Constitution matter not when politics is at stake.
Something I probably wouldn't have done or maybe gotten away with in a more organized investigation, a more organized administration, in the George W. Bush administration, for example, or the Obama administration.
Something you wouldn't have gotten away with in any other administration? So to be clear, the FBI went to great lengths to disavow Flynn of any concerns, telling him no lawyers need to be there. A plan that Comey, McCabe, and Strzok strategized, going to great lengths to keep even the Department of Justice out. And we now know that there were many arguments about whether or not they could and should do this. So you may be sitting there saying, hey, Flynn was a general. He should have known not to lie. You're right. You are right. But what is a lie? Is it a mistake? A misremembrance? A memory that simply doesn't remember everything? Or an untruth? And if an untruth, does it require an intent to deceive to be a lie? Now, Flynn already knew that any conversation he had with the Russians was recorded and that the FBI would certainly have a transcript of his conversation with the Russian ambassador, so there would be no point in lying. Even more compelling, Agent Strzok and the other FBI agent who interviewed Flynn say he did not lie. Quote, both had the impression at the time that Flynn was not lying and did not think he was lying. They even said he was unguarded and friendly. The notes further describe that Flynn did not give any indication of deception. Curious, however, is the failure of the FBI and the special counsel to provide the FBI's 302 of Flynn to Judge Sullivan. So how does the FBI file a false statement charge when the FBI thought it was no lie? And you're probably asking yourself, why would Flynn even plead guilty to lying when he wasn't lying? The answer? Flynn, based on his record of 33 years as a decorated military man, is an honorable man who may have realized when he saw the transcript that what he said was not consistent with the transcript. Or maybe he pled guilty because he ran out of money to defend himself, even having to sell his house to survive. Or maybe to save his son, also in the crosshairs of these people. And for those of you who think the FBI was just trying to get to the truth, you're wrong. If they wanted information, if they wanted the truth, they could have shown Flynn his transcript of his conversation to refresh his recollection to get at the truth. But no, they didn't want the truth. They wanted to take down a bit player to get to the big player. On Tuesdays, the parties will appear again before Judge Emmett Sullivan, a jurist unafraid of the swamp, a judge who has a track record of calling out prosecutorial misconduct, a man who does not tolerate injustice or abuse of power. Judge Sullivan can throw out this guilty plea if he concludes the FBI intentionally interfered with their target, Flynn's constitutional right to counsel. The story of Michael Flynn continues on Tuesday.